This story is titled, My Family Treats Me Like a Doormat. Now they're planning a cruise without me and expect me to babysit. There was a time when I believed I was an integral part of my family, someone they truly valued, someone whose presence mattered. I was wrong. The realization crept in slowly over the years, settling in like a fog I refused to acknowledge. But on that evening, the weight of it hit me all at once, leaving a dull ache in my chest that refused to fade. It was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner, the kind we had every week. No matter how demanding my job got, no matter how exhausted I felt after long hours staring at lines of code and debugging endless software issues, I always made time for these dinners. They were my way of staying connected, of reminding myself that despite the chaos of adulthood, family was still my anchor. Or at least, that's what I told myself. That night, I walked through the familiar doorway of my parents' home, carrying a bottle of wine I had picked up on the way, Mom's favorite, a small gesture to show I was thinking of her. The house smelled of roasted chicken and garlic, warm and inviting, a scent that instantly transported me back to childhood. My dad, as usual, was parked in front of the television, half watching a football game while occasionally commenting on a play. My sister, Rachel, lounged on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling with the kind of practiced indifference that made it clear she was only half listening to the conversation around her. Her 2-year-old, a ball of endless energy, sat on the floor, stacking colorful blocks, pausing every few minutes to call out for attention. It was routine, predictable, comforting. I joined them, slipping into my usual seat at the dining table as we caught up on the week's happenings. Rachel talking about the latest adorable thing her toddler had done. Dad grumbling about work. Mom fussing over what side dish to serve. I shared a bit about my latest project at work, though I knew from experience that no one would really understand the details of what I did. Then, in what should have been a simple, casual moment, I asked if anyone had given any thought to Aunt Jean's retirement gift. She had been the heart of our extended family for as long as I could remember, the one who remembered birthdays, sent handwritten letters, and somehow kept everyone connected despite the passing years. I wanted to do something special for her, maybe organize a collective gift that truly honored everything she had done for us. I expected enthusiasm, or at the very least, a discussion. Instead, Rachel barely lifted her eyes from her phone as she muttered, almost absent-mindedly, "Oh, we're giving her a group gift on the cruise." The words barely registered at first. A cruise? I must have misheard. My confusion must have been evident because she finally glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly as if she was surprised by my reaction. "Yeah, the retirement trip," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "We've been planning it for months." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. My pulse quickened. A trip? A family cruise? Months of planning? No one had told me. I glanced at my mother, searching her face for an explanation, a reassurance that this was some sort of oversight, some misunderstanding. Instead, she gave me a tight, uneasy smile, the same one she used when she knew she had done something wrong but didn't want to admit it. "Oh," she said after a moment, her tone light, almost dismissive. "It's just a little getaway for Aunt Jean's retirement, a few days in Hawaii." Hawaii. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. A full-fledged vacation, a major family event that included every single adult in the family, except for me. I forced out a breath, tried to steady the rising unease in my chest. "When exactly were you all planning to tell me?" Mom's smile faltered. Rachel let out a small sigh, shifting in her seat like she had grown impatient with this entire conversation. "It's not a big deal," she said, waving a hand. "We figured it just made sense for you to stay back." The words hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken meaning. Stay back. It didn't take long for the truth to unfold. They hadn't just forgotten to invite me. They had never intended to. I was never meant to be on that cruise. I was never part of the plans. Instead, I was their solution to a problem they didn't want to deal with. Rachel barely hesitated before adding almost casually, "I mean, it's not like you'd even enjoy it that much. Cruises aren't really your thing and you don't drink. Plus, someone needs to watch the kids while we're gone." There it was. I was nothing more than a built-in babysitter, a convenient option to keep their lives running smoothly while they went off to enjoy a luxury vacation in paradise. The realization settled deep, a slow, cold burn in the pit of my stomach. I glanced at my father, hoping for some sort of protest, some acknowledgement that this was unfair, but he only shifted in his chair, his focus still half on the game, like it wasn't worth his energy to weigh in. Mom, ever the peacemaker, reached out and patted my hand. "Sweetheart, we just thought, well, you're always so great with the kids, and you're not really into these kinds of trips, are you?" I wanted to laugh, the way she said it like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful they had assigned me this role without so much as a conversation. I had spent years bending over backward for this family, countless nights babysitting at the last minute, never asking for anything in return, taking care of Rachel's kids whenever she needed a break, offering to help with holiday prep, with errands, with anything that made their lives easier. And yet, when it came to something fun, something that involved them wanting my company instead of needing my help, I wasn't even an afterthought. I wasn't part of the family in the way that mattered. My heart pounded in my ears, but my voice came out steady when I finally spoke. So let me get this straight, I said, keeping my tone even, though my hands clenched into fists beneath the table. You planned an entire family vacation and didn't even think to invite me? And your reasoning is that I'd be more helpful staying back? Babysitting? No one said anything. That silence told me everything I needed to know. The silence that followed my words was suffocating, stretching between us like an invisible chasm that none of them seemed particularly eager to cross. My mother, always the first to smooth over any tension, kept her hand on mine, her touch light but firm, as if she believed that a gentle pat and a reassuring smile could somehow erase the sharp edges of what had just been said. My father, still half absorbed in the muted hum of the television, avoided looking in my direction altogether, as if acknowledging my disappointment would somehow force him to share in it. And Rachel? Well, Rachel had already returned to her phone, her fingers scrolling idly across the screen, her posture radiating the kind of impatience that made it painfully clear she considered this conversation to be little more than an unnecessary inconvenience. I sat there staring at them, waiting for someone, anyone, to realize just how deeply they had hurt me, waiting for even the smallest flicker of guilt to pass across their faces. But none came. Instead, there was only that familiar expectation, that unspoken assumption that I would do what I had always done, what they had come to rely on without ever really stopping to think about why. It had always been this way, hadn't it? It had started small, little things here and there, favors that I had agreed to because I loved them, because it felt natural to be the one who stepped up when someone needed help. Watching Rachel's kids for an hour while she ran errands had turned into watching them for entire weekends when she and her husband wanted a break. Staying late to help clean up after family gatherings had become an unspoken responsibility that no one else even considered anymore. I had made myself available, had said yes so many times that eventually they had stopped asking altogether. And now here we were. Now they had planned an entire vacation without me, without even thinking to extend an invitation, because in their minds, I wasn't someone who belonged on that trip. I was someone who made it possible for them to go. I should have said something right then, should have made them sit in the discomfort of their own selfishness, but the words tangled in my throat, thick with the weight of years of unspoken resentment. Instead, I forced myself to swallow the lump that had formed there, blinking against the stinging pressure behind my eyes as I slowly pulled my hand back from my mother's. She must have sensed the shift in me, the way I straightened in my chair, the way my breath came a little slower, a little deeper, because she hesitated before speaking again, her voice softer now, laced with something that almost sounded like concern. She told me it wasn't personal, that they had assumed I wouldn't even be interested, that a cruise wasn't really my kind of vacation, and besides, with my work schedule, I probably wouldn't have been able to take the time off anyway. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she leaned in slightly and added that it would be such a big help if I could stay behind, that they would feel so much better knowing the kids were in good hands, that I'd always been so reliable when it came to things like this. That word, reliable, settled over me like a weight, pressing against my ribs, making it suddenly harder to breathe. Reliable. Not loved, not wanted. Just useful. I let out a slow breath, forcing a tight smile as I nodded, though I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the slow simmer of anger that I had spent years pushing down in favor of keeping the peace. I could see it so clearly now, the way they had never really seen me as an equal, the way I had always been a convenience, a placeholder, someone they expected to be there when it benefited them, but never someone they actually made space for in the moments that mattered. And the worst part? They didn't even realize it. Rachel, still scrolling, still disinterested in the storm that was building inside of me, made some offhand comment about how the kids were so excited to spend time with their favorite aunt, how they would have so much fun together, how she just knew they would be on their best behavior. And my father, as if that was somehow the final word on the matter, simply gave a small nod of approval, already turning his attention back to the game as if the conversation was over, as if I had already agreed. Maybe that was what they had expected. Maybe they thought I would sigh and shake my head and do what I always did, let my own disappointment shrink into the background, make some joke about how they owed me for this one, pretend that it didn't sting the way it did. But something inside me refused to go along with the script this time. I felt it in the way my hands curled into fists beneath the table. in the way my heartbeat thundered in my ears, in the way my breath came just a little too fast as I forced myself to sit there, to really sit in it, to acknowledge just how much this hurt. I thought about every single time I had dropped everything to accommodate them, every single time I had rearranged my schedule, every single time I had put their needs above my own. I thought about how not once had any of them ever done the same for me. And then slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back and stood. The scrape of wood against tile seemed to finally pull Rachel's attention away from her phone, her head tilting slightly as she glanced up at me, eyebrows raised in vague curiosity, like she had only just now realized that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely on board with what was happening. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at them, really looked at them, taking in the way my father had already shifted his focus back to the game, the way my mother was watching me with that same uncertain smile, the way Rachel was still holding her phone, still half distracted, waiting for me to brush this off like I always did. But I wasn't going to. Not this time. I let the silence stretch between us, let them sit in it for just a moment longer, before finally exhaling, my voice steady but sharp as I told them that I wouldn't be watching the kids, that they would need to figure something else out, that I was done being their backup plan. Rachel blinked, caught off guard, as if it had never once occurred to her that I might say no. My mother started to protest, started to tell me that I was overreacting, that I was taking it too personally, that they hadn't meant it like that. But I was already turning toward the door, already reaching for my coat. And as I stepped outside, as the cool night air hit my skin, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one left holding the weight of their expectations. They could figure it out on their own, because I wasn't going to be their doormat anymore. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. The streets of Seattle stretched out before me in winding, rain-slicked roads, the glow of streetlights casting long, wavering reflections across the pavement. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, my mind replaying every second of that dinner, every word left unsaid, every expectation they had so easily placed upon me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I should have felt relieved. I had stood up for myself. I had finally told them no. But all I felt was a strange, hollow ache in my chest, as if some fragile thread had been cut, leaving me weightless in a way that wasn't freeing. It was isolating. By the time I reached my apartment, the initial fire in my veins had cooled into something heavier, something that settled deep in my bones. I let myself in, shutting the door behind me with more force than intended, the sound echoing in the quiet space. The hum of my refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the distant sound of rain against the window. These were the only things greeting me. It hit me then, as I stood there in the dim light of my small but well-kept home, that I had spent so much of my life showing up for my family that I had never really stopped to ask myself if they would ever do the same for me. And now that I had drawn a line in the sand, I wasn't sure what came next. Would they call me tomorrow, apologetic and full of regret? Would they even acknowledge how much they had hurt me? Or would they simply move on, write me off as difficult, the one who had caused the problem rather than the one who had finally spoken up about it? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The first text came in from my mother less than an hour later, her tone careful, her words deliberately chosen. She told me she didn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of this, that the family had never meant to exclude me, that they had simply assumed I would be happier staying behind. She ended the message with a line that made my stomach twist. "We just thought it was what you'd prefer. We didn't think you'd mind," as if that made it better, as if my feelings only mattered in the context of their assumptions. The second message, from Rachel, came not long after, and hers was even worse. She didn't bother with sugarcoating, didn't try to soften the edges of what she wanted to say. She told me I was being selfish, that she and Mom had already worked everything out, that it was ridiculous for me to make such a fuss over something as simple as watching my niece and nephew for a few days. She said I was overreacting, that I had always been so good with the kids, and that she honestly didn't get why I was making such a big deal about it now. Like I was the one causing the problem. Like I was the one being unreasonable. I read the messages once, twice, then set my phone down on the counter, pressing my palms against the cool surface as I forced myself to breathe. I shouldn't have been surprised. Of course, they weren't going to see my side of it. Of course, they weren't going to acknowledge how much it hurt to be left out of something so big, something so meaningful, and then expected to fill the gap they had left behind without complaint. Because to them, I wasn't a person with feelings, with wants and needs of my own. I was a role to be filled, reliable, responsible, the one who could be counted on. The doormat. A sharp knock at my door shattered the quiet, jolting me from my thoughts. My heart jumped in my chest, a strange mixture of anticipation and dread curling in my stomach. I already knew who it was before I even crossed the room, before I pulled the door open and found my mother standing there, her expression carefully composed, but not quite managing to hide the worry in her eyes. She had come in person. That meant she was serious. I stepped aside, letting her in without a word, watching as she smoothed her hands down the front of her coat, a nervous habit she had had for as long as I could remember. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally, she sighed. She told me she had come to talk, to clear the air, to help me see reason. She told me that Rachel hadn't meant to hurt me, that none of them had, that this had all been a simple misunderstanding and that I was blowing it out of proportion. She told me that family takes care of each other, that I had always been so good at that it was a gift to be someone people could depend on. She told me I was being unfair, and that was when something in me snapped. For years, I had swallowed my feelings, had let myself be the helper, the one who put others first, the one who never asked for much in return. And now, standing in my own apartment, being told that my pain was somehow unfair to them, I couldn't do it anymore. I told her that it wasn't about babysitting. It wasn't about whether or not I loved my niece and nephew. It was about the fact that my family had made a decision, a big one, a meaningful one, and I hadn't even been considered. I told her that it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, one where I was always expected to be there for them, but never once was I invited to simply be with them. I told her that for once, I wanted to be seen as more than just the reliable one. And then I asked her a question I had never dared ask before. I asked her if the roles were reversed, would Rachel ever be expected to do the same for me? The silence that followed was deafening. She didn't have an answer, or maybe she did, and she just didn't want to say it out loud. She left soon after that, telling me she needed time to think, that she hoped I would come around before the trip. She told me she loved me, but there was a hesitation in her voice, a carefulness in her words that hadn't been there before. And as I closed the door behind her, as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, I realized something. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe I never had been. Frist update. The days that followed felt like walking through a haze, a strange and quiet limbo where I was waiting for something to happen, but unsure of what it would be. My mother had left my apartment with a carefully measured expression, one that I recognized all too well, the face she wore when she wanted to end a conversation on her terms, when she wasn't ready to acknowledge what had been said but also couldn't deny that it had struck a nerve. I'd given her something to think about, something that had unsettled her, though whether that was because she finally understood my point or simply because she didn't like hearing it, I wasn't sure. I didn't reach out first, and neither did she. For the first time in years, I let the silence sit between us without rushing to fix it, without trying to smooth over the rough edges. Rachel, however, wasn't nearly as patient. Her first text arrived the next afternoon, short, clipped, and dripping with barely restrained irritation. She told me that I was making everything harder than it needed to be, that I was putting Mom through unnecessary stress, that I was being selfish over something that should have been a simple favor. I ignored it. The second message came a few hours later. This time, her frustration was louder, the words pressing against the screen with an urgency that made it clear she wasn't just annoyed, she was angry. She told me that I was being dramatic, that I was acting like a child, that she couldn't believe I was willing to throw away family over something as small as this. I ignored that one too. By the third message, her patience had clearly run out. She told me that if I wasn't willing to step up for the family, then maybe I wasn't really part of it to begin with. And that one I read over and over again. Maybe I wasn't really part of the family. I shouldn't have been surprised. It was exactly the kind of thing Rachel would say when she didn't get her way. Harsh, unfiltered, designed to cut deep and force me back into my place. But this time, it didn't land the way she wanted it to. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of that possibility. If being part of the family meant being treated like an afterthought, a convenient option when it suited them, an extra pair of hands rather than an equal, then maybe I was better off on the outside. I didn't respond. By the time the weekend rolled around, the group chat for our extended family was buzzing with messages about the upcoming trip, packing lists, last-minute bookings, excited comments about excursions and restaurants and shows they wanted to see. I watched the messages roll in from my place on the sidelines, unseen, unnoticed, as if I had never been part of the conversation at all, as if I had never been part of the family at all. And yet, even as I read their messages, even as I felt the sting of exclusion settle deeper into my chest, there was a strange sense of relief, too, because this time, I had made the choice. I had chosen to step away. I'd chosen to say no, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. But my mother wasn't quite ready to let things go. Sunday evening, just as I was settling onto my couch with a book and a glass of wine, her name lit up my phone screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe the last sliver of hope that she had finally understood, made me pick up. Her voice was softer this time, less rehearsed, less defensive. She told me she had been thinking about what I said, that she had gone over our conversation again and again, that she hadn't realized how much I had been feeling like an outsider in my own family. She told me she didn't want to lose me. But then, always a but, she told me she still didn't understand why I was making such a big deal about this one thing. This one thing, as if this was the first time they had made me feel this way. As if it wasn't the culmination of years of being overlooked, dismissed, and expected to put my own needs second to everyone else's. She told me she wasn't asking me to change my mind, only that she wanted me to come to dinner before they left for the trip, that she wanted to see me, that she didn't want this to be the thing that created distance between us, as if the distance hadn't already been there for years. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to let them leave without a goodbye, to hold my ground until they finally understood that I wasn't just going to fall back into place. But another part of me, the part that still longed for the kind of family I had always wanted them to be, said yes. Because despite everything, despite the way they had hurt me, I still wanted to be seen, even if they were never capable of truly seeing me. Second update. The night of the farewell dinner arrived faster than I expected, and as I stood outside my parents' house, staring at the warmly lit windows, I found myself hesitating. For years, this house had been a place of routine, of expectations, of quiet obligations that had never been spoken out loud, but had always existed, pressing against my shoulders like a weight I wasn't allowed to put down. I had always walked through that door prepared to be helpful, to be agreeable, to be the reliable one. But now I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and finally stepped inside. Everything looked the same, but I felt different. The familiar scent of my mother's cooking drifted through the air, warm and inviting, the kind of smell that should have made me feel at home but instead left a hollow ache in my chest. My dad was already at the dining table, idly scrolling through his phone, while Rachel stood by the counter, casually sipping a glass of wine, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. For a brief, fleeting moment, I wondered if this was going to be one of those nights, the kind where everything was swept under the rug, where nothing was actually discussed but instead carefully maneuvered around, where the discomfort was dulled by forced laughter and half-hearted conversation. But then my mother turned from the stove, spotted me in the doorway, and let out a breath like she had been holding it in since the last time we spoke. She smiled, small, cautious, before stepping forward and saying she was glad I came. I nodded, but I didn't return the smile. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure why I had come. Maybe part of me still wanted to believe that there was something salvageable here, that my mother's message about not wanting to lose me meant something more than just keeping the peace. Maybe I wanted proof that they had taken these last few days to really think about what had happened, to understand that this wasn't about a single trip, but about everything that had led up to it. Maybe I just wanted to know that I mattered to them beyond my usefulness. But as the dinner unfolded, as conversation drifted from their trip plans to work updates to anything but what actually needed to be said, it became painfully clear that nothing had really changed. Rachel talked about excursions they had booked, about how excited the kids were, about how she had found the perfect dress for the formal dinner night on the cruise. My dad, as always, remained mostly quiet, chiming in only when necessary, making it clear that he saw no real issue here, or at the very least, no reason to bring it up. And my mother? She kept looking at me like she was waiting for me to snap out of it, to put this behind me, to let it go the way I always had. As if she believed that my presence here meant I was already halfway there. But I wasn't, because with every passing minute, with every offhand comment, with every expectation that I would simply absorb the hurt and let it dissolve, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done, and that was so much worse. The weight of years of disappointments, of exclusions, of being placed in a role rather than recognized as a person, settled over me like a final, undeniable truth. So when Rachel turned to me with an easy, careless tone and said, "Well, I guess everything worked out in the end. You didn't really want to come anyway, right?" Something in me snapped into place. I set my fork down carefully, deliberately, my movements slow as I exhaled through my nose. And then, without raising my voice, without any hint of emotion except for the quiet certainty that I had finally reached the end of my patience, I told her the truth. I told her that no, I had never been given the chance to decide whether or not I wanted to go, because that decision had already been made for me. I told her that I did mind, that I had always minded, that being the one who stayed behind, the one who made things easier for everyone else, the one who was expected to be there when they needed something but was never considered when it came to things that actually mattered, it hurt. I told her that this wasn't about the trip. It was about every single time before this. I told her that I wasn't upset because they had planned a vacation without me. I was upset because they had never even thought to include me, because I wasn't part of their plans, because I wasn't part of their considerations, Because to them, I wasn't a person with my own wants, my own needs, my own right to be invited into joy. I was just the one who stayed behind, and I was done being that person. The room fell into silence. Rachel looked stunned, like she had never even considered the possibility that I felt this way. That this wasn't just me being difficult, but rather me finally telling the truth I had swallowed for years. My mother, who had always been the best at pretending things weren't as bad as they actually were, stared at me, her lips parted slightly, her hands twitching at her sides like she wanted to fix this, to smooth it over, to make it go away. And my father? He just sighed, like he had expected this outcome all along. I pushed my chair back, standing slowly, my hands steady as I gathered my things. Then, without waiting for anyone to stop me, I said what I had come here to say. I told them that I wasn't going to be their afterthought anymore, that I wasn't going to be their convenience, that if they wanted me in their lives, then they needed to make space for me, not just when they needed something, but because they actually wanted me there. And if they couldn't do that, then I wasn't sure what kind of family we even were. I left before anyone could argue. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, as I took a deep breath that finally felt free, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And I didn't regret it, not one bit. Final update. The night air felt different as I walked away from my parents' house. Not just cool against my skin, but lighter, like I had shed something heavy I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For so long, I had been trapped in this cycle of showing up, stepping in, making things easier, never questioning why it was always me, never allowing myself to wonder what it would feel like to simply exist within my family instead of serving a purpose. But now, for the first time, I had broken free of that role. And I wasn't sure what came next. The drive home was quiet. My phone buzzed a few times. Messages I didn't bother to check. I knew what they would say. Rachel would be furious, unable to comprehend how I could have embarrassed her like that, how I could have turned something so small into something so dramatic. My mother would be more careful with her words, softer in her disappointment, asking if we could talk, if I could come back over, if we could work this out before they left. But I wasn't going back. Not this time. Because this wasn't something to be worked out. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be patched up with a few gentle reassurances and a forced apology. This was the truth. Raw, undeniable, and finally spoken aloud. They had left me out because they had never considered me in the first place, and I'd spent too many years accepting that. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, a strange sort of calm had settled over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just done. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. The kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes when your mind has finally let go of something it's been gripping too tightly. Sunlight streamed through my window, warming my face, and for the first time in days, I felt at peace. I made a cup of coffee, sat on my balcony, and let myself breathe. Not waiting for a call, not waiting for an apology, not waiting to be invited into the parts of their lives that I should have already belonged to. Instead, I thought about me, what I wanted, what I needed, what my life could look like if I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to other people. It wasn't an easy shift. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. There were moments where I felt the old habits creeping back in, the urge to fix things, to smooth things over, to reach out first just so the silence wouldn't feel so permanent. But every time I felt myself slipping, I reminded myself of one simple truth. I deserved more than this. I deserved to be chosen, to be considered, to be valued for who I was, not just for what I could do for them. And if my family couldn't give me that, then maybe I'd been clinging to an idea of them that had never really existed in the first place. The cruise came and went without another word from me. I didn't reach out. I didn't check in. I didn't follow their trip through the endless stream of group chat photos and excited updates. I let them go. And in doing so, I found myself, because in the end, choosing yourself isn't about walking away in anger. It isn't about making grand declarations or proving a point. It's about realizing your own worth and refusing to settle for anything less. And for the first time in my life, I had done exactly that. And it felt incredible.